After he graduated from Cambridge University, William Wilberforce made it his habit to spend almost every evening watching and listening to the debates in the House of Commons. He was fascinated by the verbal give and take. He was also interested in the important matters that the members of Parliament debated. The British North American colonies, that we now know as the United States, were just then fighting for their independence. Wilberforce wanted to know why his country was at war with the colonies. Why were the colonies fighting? And how did Parliament make its decisions about the colonies? As he spent time in the gallery night after night, Wilberforce became aware that another young man, William Pitt, was also spending every evening in the gallery. The two soon introduced themselves. William Pitt was the son of a former prime minister. He was only a couple of months older than Wilberforce. He too had studied at Cambridge, but in another college. Both men wanted to go into politics. Pitt, because he was passionate about politics, and Wilberforce, simply because he couldn't think of anything better to do. Only a few months after they first met in 1780, Pitt and Wilberforce realized they might be able to fulfill their dreams. An election was to be held that fall, barely a week after Wilberforce turned 21. A man had to be 21 years old to be elected to Parliament. Why not run? Wilberforce used every means at his disposal to win a seat in Parliament. He used his powerful voice, some called it the voice of an angel, to make speeches everywhere he could. He used his birthday as an excuse to throwing a lavish feast, to which he invited all the electors. When the election finally came and the votes were all counted, Wilberforce had won a seat by a landslide. He had received exactly the same number of votes, 1,126, as his two opponents had received together. For Pitt, however, it was another story. He was the one who really cared whether he won or lost, but he failed to get the votes he needed. The two men obviously would soon have to part company. 3 months later, however, a wealthy man gave Pitt the right to represent the borough of Appleby, and so Pitt was able to join Wilberforce in the House of Commons. When Pitt joined Parliament in January 1781, he and Wilberforce took up their relationship where they had left off. Their friendship blossomed, and they were soon inseparable, not only at Parliament, but out on the town too. They ate, drank, foined, played cards, sang, and danced. Remember, foined means to uh, make verbal jabs at each other and just kind of have fun. Many nights they went simply to Wilberforce's house where they ate dinner together. They also played practical jokes on one another and on others. During their first 3 years in Parliament, Wilberforce became known for his quick wit and charm, but he wielded no power as a politician. Pitt, on the other hand, distinguished himself so much as a politician that at the age of 24, the king appointed him to be prime minister. The most powerful government position besides that of the king himself. No man before or since has ever been raised to prime minister at such a young age. Chapter 3: A Divided Country. Wilberforce and his friends enjoyed a manner of life that was far removed from the great majority of people in England at the time. Members of the upper class, as we have seen, squandered their time and money in singing and dancing, attending large banquets, drinking, foining, and gambling. Their waking hours often extended from midday till dawn, or from mid morning until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. Their excesses were sometimes a source of legends. One young man lost 10,000 pounds, or dollars in the English money, the equivalent of 1,000 people's wages for a year, in a single night's gambling. He lost that. Others gambled away fortunes of more than £1 million, though to lose that much usually took a few years. Men drank to excess. Some writers commented that a couple of prime ministers stumbled into Parliament so drunk they couldn't remain standing on their own power. Such behavior led many people to gossip and snicker. But no one ever reprimanded the prime minister for acting that way. It was the same when young men of the upper classes got together and ran wild through the town at night. At least once, a band of young men knocked down and beat up some elderly watchmen who were standing guard at their posts. But no one dared say a word. For the upper classes, it seemed, life was a dream, and they could do no wrong. For people in the lower classes, meanwhile, life was a nightmare, and they could do no right. While the rich seemed to throw their money away, there were actually poorer people than the poor. They suffered greater indignities, and they lacked all freedom. By the time Wilberforce became a man, they were rarely seen in England itself. Most of them lived in the colonies, especially in the West Indies, the islands of the Caribbean. This third group of people was the slaves. They were men and women who had been captured in Africa, then transported across the Atlantic Ocean and sold into slavery. After being captured, these black African slaves were placed aboard ships where they were sometimes forced to lie down, chained together side by side with less than 3 feet of room between the deck and the next. And they had only inches more than a full body width in which to lie down. They were required to remain lying down for the better part of 6 weeks while the boat crossed the ocean. If the weather was bad, they were forced to lie where they were throughout the storm with no respite. If the storm lasted a week, then they would lie there for a week. They were not permitted to go to the bathroom. If someone got sick and vomited, they and their neighbors had to lie in the vomit. If someone died, as many did, the body stayed where it was until the storm passed. If the weather was nice, the ship's crew would sometimes bring the slaves on deck to enjoy the fresh air. Except while they were on deck, one of the crew members would crack a whip to keep the slaves dancing. It was a ghastly form of exercise. By the time the ship arrived at its destination, sometimes as many as a third of the potential slaves had died, and a large part of the surviving slaves were sick. Those who were sick would be fed and permitted a brief time to recover from the trip across the Atlantic. That was not an act of mercy on the part of their captors. It was so that these slaves would appear healthy and could obtain a good sale price when they were sold at auction. There were few, if any, legal protections given slaves against cruel or inhumane treatment by slave ship captains or masters.